This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello, and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn and I are delighted to be joined by Dee Liebhart. Dee Leibhart is a nurse and writer. She writes and sometimes lives stories about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, where they learn that life is rarely predictable and answers to life's most complex questions are almost never black and white. House on Fire, her first novel, won the 2023 Page Turner Award for both fiction and debut. It was longlisted for the 2022 Petrichor Prize and received an honorable mention from Writer's Digest. Her essay, Thalassophobia, a true account of a very out-of-the-ordinary honeymoon, won the 2021 Linda Julian Creative Nonfiction Prize from Emory's Journal and is available on her website. Well, welcome, Dee.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So today we thought we would talk about turning real life into fiction. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience doing that? Because I know you mentioned that your novel has a lot of real life built into it.
Yeah, and I think that when I was thinking about some of those other things in short stories, I think I've pretty much done this all the time. And I definitely take for novels, I've taken a lot of my own life and things like that. So House on Fire is the story of a nurse, an ICU nurse who is asked by her mother to euthanize her father. So the parts of that that are true are that I'm a nurse. I was an ICU nurse. I'm not anymore. And my dad did have dementia for 10 years. And the story idea came from something that would happen with my mom all the time. My mom and I would talk. My mom was, I always describe my mom as overly optimistic, not negative, but just very positive, a very positive person, always looking on the bright side. And it was very rare for her to say negative things. And she would sometimes, we would be sitting drinking a glass of wine and she would say, that my dad never deserved this. And then that if he'd known this was going to happen to himself, he would have killed himself. And once I started thinking about that line and that word, and that there's something very similar to that in the book, was, well, what if, you knew that? What if you knew that about somebody? What if they had said all those things and then you thought that was something that you had to do for them? Could you do it? How would you do it? And it became following that moral trajectory of, is it morally right? Is it humanly right? And then what do we owe other people? So it really became this great vehicle for all of these, ethical and moral questions, which I'm very fascinated by. And then I think trying to do, I get very frustrated when I have experience with something and someone writes something and you're like, did you talk to anybody who's a nurse? Because that makes no sense. And and so I think in every medical professional who watches, Grey's Anatomy or something like that, you're just like, oh my gosh, how did you, the classic one I think for nurses is doctors doing everything in a hospital that nurses actually do. So I think there were a lot of those things that sort of attracted me to writing a story that I thought was genuine about nursing, about families, and about families dealing with dementia. And they were things that I all had, had a lot of knowledge about.
Yeah. So all right, so we've got the real life aspect of the story and the inspiration. Tell me a little bit about choosing to put yourself into your story in that way before we talk about the craft of that conversion from fact to fiction. Did you feel vulnerable as the author behind the story, putting aspects of your real life in there? Was that a challenge?
I think the challenge becomes a little bit more of, to me, I think the challenge is, everything So when you're creating those characters, you know them, you know what your head is, you know what your family is. And so if you're using people that you know as models, they tend to be, I think, a little flatter.
Mm.
Because you don't put in the detail that the reader actually needs to make this character themselves. So I think always the very first draft, I think is got that like layer of maybe not being as deep as it needs to be. And I actually worked with Jamie Attenberg there's a school in Canada called the Humber School for Writers. I have a master. I have two master's degrees. I have a master's degree in literature and I have a master's degree in nursing. And I had chosen very definitively not to do an MFA because I couldn't possibly do another master's degree. And so Humber has a certificate in writing that's like a postmaster. So it's just a year-long program and it's only the hands-on part. It's not like classes about teaching or anything like that that most MFAs include. So I did that program, and Jamie Attenberg was the mentor for House on Fire. And she read, I think it was the very first draft, to be perfectly honest. And that actually we'll get into if we start talking about revision, why I chose to do that class so early is an interesting choice that I made. And one of the things that she kept on talking to me about was not having the conversation. Like I wasn't putting the conversation on the paper. I was walking away from all the conflict. And that was because that's who my family was, right? So my family was maybe not having those conversations. I knew, and she said, you cannot say this one more time, that like the main character knows what the mother's thinking. I was like, but I did, like I do, and so she's like, you just can't do that. She said, that's not a book, that's something else. And so trying to move beyond those characters that are not characters necessarily, but have to become their own characters. So I think that's one of the big things when you're using, especially your own life and your own characters, you have to give the readers the details they need. And I think those characters have to become their own people. And that definitely happened quite, I would say, with every character. The only character that I think probably is very genuinely my family is the person with dementia, which was my father. I mean, I think that was a very, very clear representation of who my father was with dementia. And there are only a few scenes in the book without dementia, and almost all of those are pretty genuine things something that happened that was very similar. So I'd say that's the character that I did the least amount of work to make it to somebody else. But everybody else has got a lot of qualities that they became their own characters, especially I think me in the book. So I say to people, like, when they read the book, I said, like, I'm not the main character. If I was anybody in this story, I'm the character you like the least. So I'm the character who's not in the book, so yeah.
Yeah. So talk about the process of starting with real life people and then turning them into characters. What's the sort of thought process evolution as you make that transition from first draft to fully developed cast of characters in this novel?
In this novel, and I kind of step back a little bit in terms of my writing career, if you call it a writing career. The I often write short stories that are based on little tidbits of things that I get. Like I'm a collector of tidbits. And so I'll see like a little news article about something odd. I'm definitely attracted to things that are odd. And so I'll see something and then I'll write something about that. I'll save little, newspaper articles, or I'll save little things that I overheard or something like that. So I think that's one way of stealing from real life and taking these interesting things. But then those characters are 100% like my fabrication, my creation. I think what I do now a little bit more is take multitudes of people and make them into characters. So there's a character in the book, and it's pretty funny too, because I invited my friends over to the house who one of the characters is named after and looks exactly like a friend of mine. And I forgot that that's who it was. Like I forgot. So I was talking to their partner who had read my book, and she's like, and you spelled Shane exactly like Shane. And I was like, oh yeah, because it is Shane, and the physical part is my friend Shane, right? And the name is spelled a little unusually, so that was a spelling I chose, and it's the long hair and the lean body and all these things, but then it's mixed with another person. The personality is somebody totally different. And so I'll kind of do that. I'll say like, oh, it, looks like Amy, but acts like Andrea, it like has a history like this person. And so I'll start putting all of those pieces together to create a character. And then eventually what happens is kind of that classic thing that, we experience as writers where the character becomes their own person. And they're
Mhm.
like, well, yeah, no, I didn't do that. This is what I actually did. And you're like, oh, cool, good. Now I know that. And so then it starts being its own entity. So I think that's kind of what I do now is that process of like trying to piece together a character, and then through the revision process, they become their own character. And I think that part's vital. Like they have to become their own person that has their own internal integrity in the story. Like this
Mhm.
person would do this, not because, oh, my friend would do that, but because this character has now become, real.
Right.
Did I answer your question at all? I feel like,
Yeah. Yeah, I think we got a good sense of the process of transformation that happened as
Mhm.
you developed these characters. Yeah.
I would struggle. I would struggle with having a character because, like you said, if you have someone from real life, they're kind of too flat. I think I would struggle to portray them really because I don't want them to read it and think, that's what you think of me.
Yeah.
Like, so they wouldn't have the same flaws, right, that they do in person because you don't want to be the one that pointed that out.
Mhm.
But then your actual characters have to have that. So I like that idea of, okay, this is what I need. Let's combine it with different people that because different people, as you combine them, you're going to get those flaws and that roundness, right? And you can say, well, it's not really you. I used you for this part, or I used you for that part. And that's pretty cool. That's a good idea of being able to look in your real life and yet not.
Mhm. Oh, I mean, because
So,
people are fascinating. I
oh
mean,
my
that's
gosh,
the thing
yes.
too, right? I mean, my day job is I run a nurse residency program.
Mm.
And I was talking to one of our residents, and she just, sort of dropped this in a conversation. She's like, yeah, I grew up in a cult. And I was like, oh, wait, excuse me?
Come
And
back. Let me interview you.
and you think, at first I thought it was like someone maybe just kind of dropping that as a joke, like, and then I said, like, can you tell me more about that? And she said, oh yeah, no, bona fide cult, like in all the books about cults and, all this. And so I was like, okay, we need to go have lunch so we can chit chat about this because I absolutely need to know more about that.
Fascinating.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think one of the dilemmas, that you just said was I have my next book. One of the main characters is a mother who finds out that her son is a white supremacist.
Mm.
And that is based on a friend of mine who went through a pretty traumatic adolescence with her sons, and she's a big fan of my first book, and I had to write her a letter, and I had to say, like, look, I'm, you're a friend. I love you. I don't want to hurt you. This is not who I think you are. This is a different character. This is not how you dealt with this. It's not your story, but it is that story. And you
Mm-hmm.
will see yourself there. You will see things. And, we had to have a conversation, and she chose not to read it at this point.
Mm.
And I completely understand that. And I respect that. Because I don't want to lose your friendship. And then at the same time, I was like, and I'm still going to write the story. Like, because it was such a compelling thing to watch. And I think the thing for me too is like that, like being attracted to the odd, and odd's not the right word for that, but the unusual, because it's not that unusual, right? This is what human beings
Mhm.
are going through in our society, um, and families are going through. And I think we very rarely see those genuine stories. We see these like kind of superficial stories, without getting to the heart of things. And I don't want to write. I don't want to write like, oh, you sent him to military school and everything was fine. It's like, no, 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 that's not at all what happened, right? This is we're talking 6-7 years later, and it's still not okay.
Mhm.
And so that's the true story. The true story is that, not black and white. That's my big thing. It's like there's no one answer to this. There's no one side of it. And no matter what anybody decides, no one was right. Everybody was right in their own way for the most part,
Right. Right. So was your friend understanding of your desire to write the story? Was there any, danger of her thinking that you were intruding in her life or picking her life apart or something?
Oh, I think there was. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think there definitely was. And what I did, I kind of wrote the story without saying anything to her at first. I was writing it, and my daughter and I have kind of a long-standing joke because my daughter's in the book as well. And so some things I'm in the book. There's one of the characters is based on me and my daughter and something that we went through. And again, but it's not us, right? So it's some of the pieces of what we went through, but it's not us. And my daughter just jokes, I'm going to sue you, and I'm going to, all this kind of stuff. I'm like, I'm going to stop paying for your college education if you sue me. And so we have a more lighthearted way of dealing with it because, well, one, because she hasn't read it, and two, because I think she maybe understands that it's not her, and that it's that piece of her story that I think is meaningful to share, but it's definitely not her. Whereas I think with my friend, this is a friend. This is not somebody who I've taken care of. It's not somebody that, who needs me to pay for their college education. I think that there's this aspect of like she could much more easily than my daughter walk away.
Mhm.
And so I think I was scared, and I actually wrote a blog post about it, and I had her read that first.
Mhm.
I kind of talked about my process of, taking things from real life. And then I kind of said, I'm taking something from someone's life that I care about, and I don't know how they're going to feel about it. And I let her read that first. And then I told her, I said, that's you, it's you that I'm worried about. And I want you to let you know this. And I don't expect you to read it if you don't want to. And I kind of said, you have the right to read it, and you have the right to be mad at me. But at the same time, it wasn't like that. You don't have the right to stop me from telling the story, which is me as a writer, like saying this is what I do. Right.
Mhm.
So, and whether I don't think it's unethical, but I think, that you could potentially cross a line. It's not her story, and she couldn't go, again, we're getting into the weeds here, right? She couldn't
Right.
go into a court of law and go, look, that's my story. Because, you can turn around and read, and I read a couple books about kids who had come out of white supremacy and things like that. And it's their story too. It's exactly their
Mhm.
story. It's the story of their parents. It's them. Um, it's there's a part of I can't remember her name, Klebold. I can't remember her first name. So her son was one of the Columbine shooters.
Mhm.
She has a memoir about that, and it's from that. It's from all of these mothers' stories of raising children that you get into challenges where you're not ready for them. So it's not just that story, right? It's not just her
Right.
story. So I feel like, I feel like I'm not crossing an ethical line in that regard. I'm not just
Mhm.
rephrasing someone's life and then calling it fiction.
Right.
Right.
It was inspired by,
Right,
right? The
right.
idea was inspired by, and I mean, how else are you going to find your ideas except for in the world around you? So,
Mhm.
Mhm.
yeah.
Very true. Yeah, and I think that's one of the benefits of fiction over memoir is that we
Hmm.
do conduct so much research and draw from so many different sources to find those key elements that go into creating an entire arc because we aren't just following a trajectory that is set in a personal history. We're
Mhm.
inventing something. And so, we get to pick and choose and craft and shape and invent. And
Hmm.
yeah, yeah, I still think it's interesting how the people in our lives can feel vulnerable
Mhm.
around our writing because it creates that pressure point for us of what can I touch on? What can I not? What is the balance, with this relationship and my art and such? Mhm.
Yeah. Well, I would think that there's that. It's whether or not you were writing it about her. right? That she had an experience, even if it was similar. I mean, you could even be unearthing things that you didn't even know in your friends' lives, And so I think that's where that vulnerability comes in, right? Where it's something that maybe it's a hurt that you've buried deeply, and then the fiction brings it back out. So that's where that vulnerability can become, where that's a conversation to be had. I think it's so cool that you wrote her a letter, and whether she reads it or not, that's a conversation that you get to have with a friend about something that's potentially very tough and traumatic, that you can open up different channels of conversation or a deeper relationship. Or not, it's her choice, right? but I mean, it's cool that, again, fiction as a bridge, as a communication device, as a way to explore things.
Well, and I think that like that is one of the things that, and especially with House on Fire, one of my goals, if you read that book, there's so much about death with dignity, and there's so much about there's a very specific reason that it's an ICU nurse, because what ICU nurses do that people don't understand is a great deal of ICU nursing is keeping people alive who under any other normal circumstance would have already died. And so it's this other side of things. And so you put that alongside someone being asked to do this, the opposite, right? To maybe end someone's life in a circumstance where they wouldn't normally die, for their benefit. And so I think that it allows those conversations. And that was one of my goals with that book, was trying to like really take that character like through the ringer in terms of the moral dilemma. And again, when you've got somebody who is on a day-to-day basis doing something that is morally questionable. I, as an ICU nurse, so many times was in situations, and every ICU nurse, that says that is, in there is probably saying the same thing. We do far more keeping people alive when we shouldn't than the opposite. To the degree that, a lot of ICU nurses are fairly jaded, and so have that, very quick, don't put me here, don't do this. I would never do this to my family member. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing to like use it to provoke conversation, and to provoke different sides of things. And I think that's what fiction can do that real life doesn't do. Like you were saying, real life doesn't give you the opportunity to look at all sides of something and really see it from all perspectives.
Yeah.
You'll want to join me in this year's 7th annual Women in Publishing Summit. It is the biggest 4-day online conference for women in publishing, with a massive community that helps authors grow their craft, network, and publishing skills. I got my ticket last fall, and I've already been blown away by the bonus sessions and networking opportunities in this lively, encouraging, enthusiastic group of authors. So blown away, in fact, that I decided to sponsor the summit. Sponsors, including me, have special offers for the whole women in publishing community, so make sure you check out the sponsors page when you get your ticket. The summit is coming up soon, in March, but don't worry about missing a thing. You'll have time to go through the recordings all year long and take advantage of all the special offers and online networking opportunities. I've got a link in the show notes so you can grab your ticket, and if you use my link, you'll be able to get your seat at the Women in Publishing Summit while showing a little love to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Also, next week, I'm having Alexa Bigworth, the woman behind the summit, at the Roundtable for a special episode all about the business side of being a writer. You won't want to miss that. All right, I hope to see you at the Women in Publishing Summit soon. Grab your seat at storyworkspodcast.com/290. That's /290. Yeah. So what did you learn about yourself doing this mental exercise of putting your character through the ringer and having your character actually enact in fiction this process, this journey, this ethical dilemma? What did you learn through that?
I wouldn't say that learned so much about myself through doing that, because I do think at some point it definitely became like its own thing. So then I was able to kind of be more separate from it. Um, I think the strangest thing, and I think I mentioned this to you earlier, was at some point I started to look at events that I had taken and put in the book, and I could no longer remember whether they were real or not, because I had spent so much time fictionalizing them and making them work. And like, for example, the house that's in the book is not my house. It's actually our neighbor's house, like across the street. Like I very deliberately, didn't choose my house. But there's events that I put that are right there. And I actually asked my husband, I was like, did this happen? Like, cause I feel like it happened. And he was like, yeah, that totally happened. And I was like, why were we there? Cause there's a scene in the book where my dad, with the dad and the character, saws a club off of a car, the anti-theft device. So my dad would want to drive, and my dad had dementia. And my mom, the way that she solved this problem was she put a club on the truck. And for whatever reason, that totally worked because he couldn't get it off. And he just kept on thinking, he would say, the truck is broken, the truck is broken. So it was great. And then he went out there it was Christmas, because I asked my husband, I was like, when were we there? Why were we there? And he just like spent hours, and then all of a sudden came back with the club in two pieces. And we were just like, oh my gosh. Like, and I had to ask my husband at some point, because I'd fictionalized it and changed it and made it very different, kind of how it happened. And I was like, did that happen? He was like, oh yeah, that totally happened. And so I think that was the the thing that happened, was realizing that like I guess, for lack of a better word, is like I've almost robbed myself of my memories. Like I had chosen to give those to the story, and I could no longer kind of own them, because I made so many of them so different, in terms of where they fit in the story. So I think I lost something, maybe, a little bit, to where some of those memories. And I will probably cry when I say this one memory, but at the end of the book, there's a section where the main character picks up her dad's clothing and smells it, and she's looking for something else, but it smells like her dad. And that's absolutely something that happened. So my dad ended up going into assisted living for the last 5 years of his life, because my mother lived with him alone and could no longer take care of him. And when my dad died, he died in assisted living. And my brother and I went there the next day, and we're cleaning things out. And I picked up my dad's laundry and smelled my dad. And I just, like, that was it. But prior to that moment, I had cried when I found out I live in a different state. My mom had called me and said that they thought, my dad was probably going to die. And so I flew out there. I cried that moment. And then I didn't cry the rest of the time. And that's nursing, because I'm dealing with this situation. I'm in it, I'm dealing it, and I'm taking care of my mother. That was my job. And then when it was all over, like, that was when it kind of hit me. And so there's moments like that are very, very real, that I don't remember as vividly and correctly, because I put them in a different circumstance and then spent years with them in a different circumstance. So
Wow.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. Do you have journals or anything where you can kind of fact check?
No. So
Okay.
I'm not a journaler. So I was a lifelong journaler until I went back and read a couple journals, and I was like, if I read one more entry about my hair looking bad and me being fat, I am going to stop doing journals. And then that was what I was like, what is this? This is not useful to me, as a writer. And it was a clear choice. I was like, this is not beneficial to me as a writer. Because all I'm doing is either I'm like, I'm not writing. I'm like, why am I not writing? I was like, this is stupid. Like, just go write, So I actively stopped journaling. I don't know how many years ago now. So I don't typically journal. So no, I don't.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's so interesting how our memories change and can actually be revised, and how in the process of crafting your story you've affected your memory. It's not surprising when I think about it, but I think it was surprising to hear how that actually happened. It makes total sense, though.
Yeah, it's like being told a story from your childhood, and pretty soon that's the story you remember, not necessarily what actually happened.
Well, and I think I think our awareness, we're aware of it, but we don't realize like memory is so fallible and so influenced and so changeable, yeah, so that someone adds a detail and then you're like, oh, and I tend to rely on my brother tends to have a pretty good memory. My husband has an unbelievable memory. And so I'll tend to rely on other people. I'll ask, certain things like those details. But then I started, with my brother, I stopped trusting my brother because I have this whole memory of going to church as a kid. And he was like, we never went to church as a kid. I was like, we so went to church as kids. Cause I have just like vivid memories of going out the side door after services and going to Sunday school. And he's like, yeah, we went to Sunday school. Mom and dad would drop us off at Sunday school. And I was like, no, that's not what happened, so then all of a sudden you're in this different circumstance where you're like, okay, I don't even know what's true. Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. Wow. So what about crafting your real experiences into a novel? Like, what would you say to somebody who is thinking about possibly doing that? We just got invaded here. There's a kitten.
Sorry.
On
My cat's
Kathryn's
like,
shoulder.
you're sitting on the couch. I'm going to sit on you.
I'm definitely a cat person, so I'm okay with it.
I know everybody's.
Yeah.
Cat.
Yeah. Well, my dog barged in with a crinkly toy, so I don't know if you'll hear any squeaks or crinkles. But she just threw my door open and ran
Secretly,
in.
there are animals.
Yes. Yeah. So, okay, people who are listening and thinking, I've got this story, but I don't feel like it's a memoir, or I don't feel like I'm able, for whatever reason, to put it out as fact. And now they're inspired, right? The wheels are turning. What words to the wise would you give them?
Ooh, I think the biggest word to the wise is real life is not interesting. Like how real life plays out is not a good story. And I think that's like with House on Fire, that's definitely the case. I that's why it's not, the real story of what happened with my dad's dementia was, a 10-year process. And none of it was, none of it followed into a good story arc with like plot points and things like that. I'm a huge plotter. And so I think that I think is the biggest risk. And I think that's something that you see a lot with folks. It's like they take an interesting thing and think that's a story, and that's not a story. And so a story has to have those points of drawing you in, and the main character being challenged with something that they have to deal with in some fashion, and then it has to reach a peak of tension. It's like all those classic kind of movie and book things. They have to be there, and very rarely does real life kind of do that. And so I think using real life as the spark, and certainly some of the real life things to give something a richness that has that real life richness to it. That's great. Like, weird things that people say. Like I have a colleague that I work with right now. I've just noticed she says yes, yes, and yes. Like when she's agreeing with you, she's like, yes. She's real like, yes, yes, yes. And I was like, yes, yes, and yes. And I was like, I got to write that down, because that's a human thing that someone has part of their personality, and it's like interesting. And so it's like you're taking those things to make your characters fleshed out, while at the same time recognizing that you've got to create that arc for the story to be meaningful to somebody and to know what you're trying to say. And I don't know if you have to have like a higher purpose with the story, but I do think you have to have kind of a message, or what your meaning is behind why you're bothering to tell the story. And so that, I think, is not in real life until after it's all over, and you're like, what did I learn from that situation? What could I learn from that situation? It's like it's an after the fact imposed thing that we put onto the events that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, with a story, you're putting it on as part of the creation process.
Right. Yeah, we discuss theme on the show all the time. I think it's one of our favorite topics because without it, there really isn't a story. You just have a series of events, and the theme is what gives it the meaning, and your story, if you had been true to life, the question of ethics and what is your responsibility to someone versus, societal judgment or whatever you are afraid of, you need to lay that over the real life events and let your characters grapple with issues and cross lines and stretch boundaries and such that we wouldn't do in real life for a myriad of reasons. And so to construct that story, to do the plotting well, you need to know what that theme is because that shapes the choices that the protagonist makes throughout.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think, like, speaking to memoir, I think that's one of the big things that, like, I'm struggling with right now in terms of writing a memoir. So the reason I've chosen to go with a memoir for the next thing that I'm writing, is because I think I have to tell the real story. So strangely enough, and it's not strange given the fact that my mother was the inspiration for House on Fire, was my mother chose to end her life by starving herself to death. And she suffered what appeared to be a minor stroke that turned out to be a major stroke, during the pandemic. And I left work and went to take care of her at the beginning, again, when we thought it was a small stroke and that we were going to do, like, I was going to be there for rehab and things like that. And then she made this choice and I took care of her through that process. And I was basically, I so many times I was like, oh my God, this is my book. Like, this is happening to me now. This is, like, not okay. I'm not okay with it. And I think to speak to that idea of putting someone through something, who I thought I was when I wrote House on Fire and who I turned out to be when I actually was asked that question were very, very different. So I don't think you can even know until you're actually there, actually in those circumstances. And we aren't in those circumstances. I didn't want to be in that circumstance. And so you can't get those challenges for your character because they don't typically happen in real life. And the questions that you want answered and the questions you want to play with and push, they don't happen. Thank goodness. To most of us, we go through our lives without having to deal with these kind of issues.
Right. Wow. That is stunning what you just described having to go through. My goodness.
Well, I think it's more interesting, and I am talking about it, and the abstract began because I'm a nurse, because that's what you do. You're able to talk about and do things because you have to have this kind of ability to turn off your emotions. Otherwise, you can't do your job, And I think that is why that story is kind of interesting to me to tell as a memoir, because there were definitely, like, kind of two people there, right? So there was me taking care of my mom as my mom, and then there was me taking care of my mom as a nurse. And so it was, the nurse thinks this, and then the daughter thinks this, and the nurse thinks this, and so I think it was really kind of, I think that's another reason that I'd like to do it as a memoir. And I think because I definitely don't want to give up this story.
Right.
It's something that I own too much of and was too emotional for me to play with.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I'm sure it's one of those rare real life stories that is so incredible. It needs to be told as it is, there's no need to fictionalize it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Ever wish you had a developmental editor on speed dial? How about the next best thing? Join me in the Writer's Circle, a free office hour where you can ask questions and get answers. The schedule is posted at wordessential.com/events. Do Do you mind if I ask what frame you're using, what narrative frame or timeline you're using for
That's my
the memoir? Okay.
That's my craft problem right now. So I'm very fond of structures and things like that. So in House on Fire, I have like what there is like a mainline story that's in the kind of in the present. It's not actually present, of course. That's
Mhm.
interspersed with like full chapter flashbacks that are like kind of their own independent thing that inform the current story. And then the
Mhm.
next book I'm writing, or that I've written, I'm in the final revision stages. I have 4 main characters with rotating voices, but the timeline going forward is in constant motion. So you never see the same thing from the same perspective. The days and the times are going forward, and so it's like kind of an arbitrary choice that I made, to make the story that way because I thought it turned out more interesting, and I do think it was useful. My
Mhm.
dilemma with the memoir is I'm telling kind of 3 or 4 different lines at the same time, and I don't know how they're going to fit together because the other piece of that story is that I'm adopted.
Mm.
And so the mother that I took care of is my mother who raised me, my mother. But I also have a biological mother that I chose to go look for and find. And then who doesn't want to know me, who chose
Oh,
not to
wow.
meet me. Yeah. And that's a fairly unusual experience for adoptees to find their adoptive parents and then to have them not want to meet.
Mhm.
And that the other very unusual thing is my biological parents are married. They got married when they
Hmm.
were pregnant with me and they remain married. So I'm 54 years old. So they've been married for 54 years. And they never had any other children. And
Wow.
my biological father would like to meet me, but my biological mother would not. And so that's this other story that I want to tell about me me having that desire to look for my birth parents, looking
Mhm.
for something. And then the other frame of that is that after my mother died, um, kind of out of her own accord, my mom started Swedish death cleaning her own house. So she would just throw stuff away. My brother said he would be at like a local thrift shop and he'd be like, that looks like my stuff. And then he would call my mom and she's like, yeah, I took it down there. And I was like, but what happened was my mom cleaned out everything from the house except like these hugely sentimental things. So we weren't going through like garbage. We were going through like just stuff that was like so heavy and weighted that we didn't even know she had.
Mhm.
And so it was really, really intense. And I suddenly realized, like, oh my gosh, everything in this house is about me and my brother, right?
Mm.
Everything is about my mom being a mom. And that is a gift that someone she never knew gave to her. And so that I was just profoundly impacted by that
Yeah.
and had the desire to write my biological mother, who I don't have contact with, a letter
Mhm.
and say thank you, to say like I know you don't want to know me, but I need to let you know this great gift that you gave to another human being that probably wasn't your intent. I don't think that your intent as a 16-year-old girl was to give this gift to somebody else, right? It was to take care of me and to take care of herself, right? um so that's like another piece of it, is like this very present day person right now thinking, and I keep thinking about it. I still haven't done it. So I'm trying to use that as a frame as well. So it's like I've got 3 different storylines, 3 different things
Mhm.
going on. I have no idea what to do with that.
Mm.
So that is my dilemma with like a memoir. That's the difference between fiction and memoirs. I cannot
Mm.
just, well, let's move all this around and just make it different and make,
Right.
but how do
Right.
I still get that same
Mhm.
intensity and same storyline in there that without falsifying anything, to the best of my
Right.
ability. Yeah.
Right. Well, um, yeah, the thought that comes to mind, if you don't mind me
Oh, I'd
sharing.
love if you can solve the problem. Go right ahead.
I'll try. I'll
Developmental
take
editor
a
hat
stab at
on.
it. Right.
Yeah.
um, yeah. So I'm wondering if one of those threads would form the arc, would form the structural foundation of the memoir, and it might be the cleaning out. So you might start, and I'm imagining and making assumptions here, so it might be incorrect, but so you could start with your mother's death or right after her death, going into the home to start this cleaning process. And then you've got this realization about what remains in the house and what it means. And as this cleaning process brings you emotional highs and lows and realizations and discoveries, if that could be the structure that then frames the journey you go on through the remaining threads of your mother's stroke and caring for her leading up to her death, as well as the adoption thread. If the one narrative could frame the other two, and you could use those discoveries in the home as a device that brings us into one or the other thread. Just wondering if there might be something in there useful.
Yeah. And that is something that I've thought about, is like, what is that core, what has the arc, where is that arc? Like, which story has an arc that's the strongest and the most compelling, and to hang those other things on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's harder. It's much harder with, my
Yeah.
memoir. Yeah.
Yeah. Your mother's dying process from the stroke to her death, and you're caring for her. That seems like it would be a very nice timeline, that's got perfect bookends built into it, a beginning and an end. And then that whole journey of being her caretaker and doing it as the nurse and as the daughter. And so perhaps the adoption story can be woven into there as the before narrative, and then the cleaning and discoveries could be woven through as the after narrative. So that might be a really nice structure as well, having the three pieces of your story as a daughter, right? Three aspects of that. And then the main through line is this arc of caring for your mom.
And I think that's the one that I think I've toyed with the most, of that, because it's a very short period of time with huge, things in it that happen.
Yeah.
And I wrote a piece for Bellevue Literary Review about that. And, of course, it was probably about 4,000 words, something like that. That's an essay. And even now when I read that, it's that same experience, right, of reading something and there's so much that's not there. So many details, you're putting into a single sentence something that you're just like, it was massive. It was huge. And so trying to figure out how to make that storyline. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting too. That was an interesting process because I worked with the editor, who's a physician, with Bellevue Literary Review. And she would give me feedback, and I would get very, very like we all do, like, get a little defensive about feedback. But I would get very defensive. I'm actually typically very good at taking feedback about fiction, but man, was I not about memoir and essay, because I was just like, no, that's not what happened, and I think that what she was getting at was like, well, the way that you're telling it is maybe not doing the right thing here. So it's like, she was like, well, what about this? And it's like, well, that's not what happened, but she was really it trying to get to something else, like maybe, why did you think this? Or why, like there was a different question that I wasn't putting there that she was trying to get to, and like kind of feeding me the answer. I think not intentionally trying to get me to change anything, but like being like, this is an example of what this could be. And so what did you actually feel? What did you actually think here, and stuff like that. So very interesting, the difference between writing something that's real and was much more raw at that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that raises an interesting point too about the difference between fictionalizing our stories and being true to our stories. When we fictionalize them, it frees us to be creative, to take that creative license with our events and with the people involved there. And then we don't feel beholden to our own facts, our own narratives, So we can do that shaping that crafting of artifice to make it art, to make it emotionally compelling for a reader instead of feeling bound by our truth, which, yeah, it's such an interesting process shaping our experiences into essays or memoir because we've got to do both. We've got to be true to our story and to our facts and shape it into that compelling journey for the reader.
And I think memoir too, I think that memoir has that, it's the truth. It doesn't have to be factual and like the day-to-day, like, what time did you do this and what did you actually do? It has to be true to itself in terms of like emotional honesty. And sometimes you really are looking at something, it's like, I have no idea, like the pieces that went up to this thing that I need to include, but I have to make them because I can't just be like, oh, I don't remember all that stuff, but then I did this, and because for the reader, that's not going to work. Right. I don't remember what my mom said, but now I'm checking her cabinets for medications that she can kill herself with. So I have to, my mother has to say something. I can't say, gee, I don't remember what my mother said. I have to make it true to what I think I remember she said, and then what makes sense. And then again with my mom, my mom was like sort of, I always say, the queen of speaking without words. My mom had facial expressions that you're like, oh, we're done for now. I think like lots of moms, right? But I think my mom was particularly gifted at it. And so again, I'm dealing with that in this book. Like, when I said something to my mom and she would look at me and I was like, oh, that was the wrong answer. Like, that was not what she was looking for. And again, how I make the reader understand that, like, because it's got to be real for the reader. I'm not just writing this for my journal. I'm not writing this for my memory. I'm writing this to try to convey this experience to someone. And so it's got to have that same richness. And I'm finding that a lot more challenging. I think once I realized that, like, I was like, I'm going to have to be okay with, I don't actually remember what she said. And I'm going to have to make it as good as I can make it to what I remember. And that's okay. Because if you don't think that's okay, you're not going to be able to write a memoir, Yeah. So.
Definitely. Let's have some final thoughts for our listeners here as we wrap up this week's episode. So, Kathryn, do you have any final questions or thoughts you want to throw out?
Awesome. Oh my gosh. No, like I write so much secondary world fiction. Sometimes it's hard to remember that it's there, where you mine the realistic fiction from. And it's just so cool. And I love the thought process and the intentionality with which you approach it. It's been really, really good. So thank you for sharing.
I sort of admire folks who world build and, who are able to really do that other place and make it real and make it genuine. I don't know that I could do that. I don't know, I don't know that I know how to do that. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dee. Where can our listeners find you?
Do you mean like websites or social media? So I definitely have my website, which is my handy dandy name. It's just Liebhart.com. And then I'm sadly on Facebook. And I say that because I was off Facebook for about 10 years prior to publishing this book and went through a moral crisis of getting on Facebook because you kind of have to. So I'm on Facebook and I'm also on Instagram, though I'm very loosely on Instagram. And the book is available, my book is available kind of in all of those big retailers. And you can also find links on my website.
Wonderful. And we will definitely have links in the show notes for this week's episode.
Great. Thank you.
My newsletter, A Room Full of Books and Pencils, is growing every week with new reflections, writing tips, and transcripts of the podcast. It's also where I make announcements about things like upcoming writing workshops and coaching sessions. Check out A Room Full of Books and Pencils at booksandpencils.substack.com. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com. wtih.com.